Picture yourself standing on the cold shores of England in the winter of 1943, staring across the dark waters of the English Channel toward occupied France, knowing that somewhere on those distant beaches lies the key to ending the most terrible war humanity has ever known. But there is a problem, a massive problem that keeps generals awake at night and makes engineers shake their heads in disbelief. How do you land an entire army on a foreign shore when every port is a death trap, when every harbor is guarded by concrete bunkers and German guns, when the enemy expects you to come knocking at their front door? The answer would turn out to be one of the most daring engineering miracles in human history, a secret so incredible that even the workers building it did not know what they were creating. This is the story of how an improvised pier changed the course of the war and put an entire army ashore in Normandy, a tale of genius and desperation, of triumph and disaster, of ordinary people doing extraordinary things under the shadow of history itself. The challenges facing the Allied forces in early 1943 seemed almost impossible to overcome. Everyone knew that to defeat Nazi Germany, the Allies would need to invade France, but the question of how to do it haunted every military planner from London to Washington. Armies need supplies, thousands of tons of supplies every single day, and those supplies need ports to come through. But every major port along the French coast was heavily defended, turned into a fortress of steel and concrete by the Germans who knew that whoever controlled the ports controlled the invasion. The memory of Dieppe still burned fresh in Allied minds, that terrible day in August 1942 when Canadian and British forces tried to capture the port town of Dieppe in a raid that turned into a bloodbath. Over 4,000 men were killed, wounded, or captured in just a few hours, and the lesson was clear and brutal. You cannot simply storm a defended port and expect to survive. The Germans would fight for every inch of dock and harbor, and even if you somehow managed to capture a port, the enemy would destroy it completely before retreating, leaving nothing but rubble and twisted metal behind. Deep in the British Admiralty and War Office, military planners wrestled with this terrible problem day after day. If you cannot capture a port, how do you supply an invasion? The answer came from an unexpected place, from a memo written decades earlier by a man who would become one of the greatest leaders of the 20th century. Winston Churchill, back in 1915 during the First World War, had sketched out a wild idea about creating temporary harbors that could be floated across water and assembled where needed. The idea had seemed too crazy at the time, too far ahead of its technology, but now in 1942, as Churchill sat as Prime Minister facing the challenge of invading France, he remembered that old concept. In May of 1942, Churchill wrote another memo with a simple but revolutionary title, Piers for Use on Beaches. In it, he challenged his military engineers with words that would change history. If we cannot capture a port, Churchill essentially said, then we must bring our own ports with us. The idea sounded like pure fantasy, like something from a science fiction story rather than serious military planning. Build entire artificial harbors in England, tow them across the English Channel, and somehow assemble them off the beaches of Normandy to create instant ports where none existed before. Engineers looked at the problems and saw a mountain of challenges. The English Channel has some of the most difficult tides in the world, rising and falling by as much as 18 feet twice a day. The weather can turn violent without warning, with storms that can smash ships against rocks and send waves towering over the decks. The distance from England to France is over 100 miles in some places, and somehow these artificial harbors would need to survive the journey, then work perfectly in combat conditions, while German artillery shells rained down and Luftwaffe bombers circled overhead. But the alternative was even worse. Without artificial harbors, the invasion would likely fail, and if the invasion failed, the war might go on for years more with millions more dead. So the engineers got to work, and what they created would become known by the code name Mulberry, an artificial harbor that would rank among the greatest engineering achievements of all time. Beginning in late 1943, a miracle of construction began all across Britain, hidden from the eyes of German spies and kept so secret that even most of the workers did not know what they were building. Over 45,000 people worked on components for the Mulberry Harbors at dozens of construction sites scattered from London to Southampton, from Portsmouth to Scotland. The scale of the project was staggering, requiring 140,000 tons of concrete and thousands of tons of steel. The Mulberry Harbor was not just one structure but a complex system of many different parts, each with its own code name and purpose, each designed to work together like pieces of a massive floating puzzle. At the heart of the system were the Phoenix caissons, enormous concrete boxes that would be sunk to the seabed to form breakwaters protecting the harbor from waves. These Phoenix units came in different sizes, but the largest were truly massive, over 200 feet long, 44 feet wide, and 35 feet tall, weighing thousands of tons each. They had to be hollow so they could float during the journey across the channel, then flooded with seawater to sink them into position on the ocean floor. Workers labored day and night building these concrete giants on slipways along the British coast, never knowing where they would go or what purpose they would serve. Security was incredibly tight because if the Germans learned about the Mulberry Harbors, they could prepare defenses or launch bombing raids to destroy the components before they ever left England. The construction sites were disguised, and workers were told only what they absolutely needed to know to do their jobs. Some workers thought they were building parts for docks or submarine pens. Others had no idea at all and simply followed the blueprints they were given, welding steel, pouring concrete, and assembling pieces of what would become one of the most important military projects of the war. Beyond the Phoenix caissons, the Mulberry system included many other innovative components. There were the bombardons, huge floating breakwaters shaped like crosses and made of steel and rubberized canvas, each about 200 feet long, designed to float on the surface and absorb the energy of incoming waves. There were the whale piers, flexible roadways made of steel bridge sections that could rise and fall with the tide while providing a path for vehicles and supplies to move from ships to shore. And there were the spud pierheads, massive floating platforms that stood on adjustable steel legs, allowing them to stay level even as the tide raised and lowered them by many feet. What made the Mulberry Harbors so brilliant was not just their size, but their clever design that solved problems no one had ever faced before. Take the spud pierheads, for example. These were floating platforms where ships could dock and unload their cargo, but they had to work in tides that changed the water level by 18 feet or more twice every day. The solution was elegantly simple. Each pierhead had 4 enormous steel legs called spuds that could be driven into the seabed. Electric winches could then raise or lower the floating platform up and down these legs, keeping it at the right height no matter what the tide was doing. Ships could pull up alongside, unload their cargo onto the pier, and trucks could drive across the whale roadways to carry supplies to the beach, all while the whole system adjusted automatically to the changing sea level. The whale roadways themselves were another stroke of genius. Engineer Alan Beckett designed these flexible bridges that could bend and flex with the waves without breaking. Each section was 80 feet long and mounted on floating pontoons, and the sections were linked together in a way that allowed them to move independently while still forming a continuous roadway. Tanks weighing 40 tons could drive across these floating roads even as waves rolled underneath, something that had never been done before. The breakwaters that would protect all these structures from ocean waves had to be equally clever. The outer ring of defense would be the bombardons, those huge floating crosses made of steel frames covered with rubberized canvas. They were designed to bob up and down with the waves, absorbing their energy and calming the water behind them. Inside the bombardon line would be the Phoenix caissons, those massive concrete boxes sunk to form a more solid barrier. And for additional protection, the British planned to use old ships called block ships, vessels that had reached the end of their useful lives and would be deliberately sunk in lines to create barriers called gooseberries. Nearly 60 old ships were gathered for this purpose, their holds filled with concrete so they would sink quickly and stay where they were placed. Together, these layers of protection would create an area of calm water where hundreds of ships could anchor and unload safely even when storms raged outside. The plan called for 2 complete Mulberry Harbors, one for the American forces at Omaha Beach and one for the British and Canadian forces at Gold Beach near the town of Arromanches. Each harbor would be as large as the port of Dover, one of the busiest ports in all of England, but these would be built from scratch in enemy territory in just a few days. As spring turned to summer in 1944, the Mulberry components were moved from their construction sites to assembly areas along the southern coast of England. The Phoenix caissons were the trickiest to handle because of their enormous size and weight. They had to be carefully floated out to designated waiting areas where they were anchored, ready to be towed across the channel when D-Day finally came. Some of the smaller components were hidden in rivers and inlets, camouflaged under trees and netting to hide them from German reconnaissance planes. The amount of material waiting to cross the channel was staggering. Hundreds of Phoenix caissons of various sizes, dozens of bombardons, over 6 miles of whale roadway sections, 23 spud pierheads, and all the blockships filled with concrete. Everything had to be ready to move at a moment's notice, because once the invasion began, there would be no time to go back for forgotten pieces. D-Day came on June 6, 1944, when Allied forces launched the largest amphibious invasion in the history of warfare. Over 150,000 troops hit the beaches of Normandy that first day, fighting their way through German defenses under murderous fire. But even as soldiers struggled on the beaches and paratroopers fought inland, another invasion was beginning, a different kind of assault involving not guns and tanks but tugboats and engineering crews. The day after D-Day, on June 7th, the first blockships began their final voyage. These old vessels, many of them survivors of the First World War, were deliberately sailed to positions off the Normandy beaches and then scuttled, flooded with seawater so they sank to the bottom, forming the first lines of the Gooseberry breakwaters. It was strange and sad to watch ships deliberately sunk, but the men doing the job knew these vessels were giving their lives for a greater purpose, becoming the foundation of the harbors that would sustain the invasion. Behind the blockships came the Phoenix caissons, towed across the channel by powerful tugboats. The crossing was agonizingly slow because the massive concrete boxes could only move at about 5 miles per hour, and the channel was over 100 miles wide. Some of the tows took more than a day, with the tugs fighting currents and winds while trying to keep their precious cargo from breaking loose or capsizing. Once in position off the beaches, crews carefully flooded the caissons, and they slowly settled to the seabed, forming walls of concrete that would break the force of incoming waves. By June 14th, just 8 days after D-Day, about half of the Phoenix caissons were in place, and the basic shape of both Mulberry Harbors was taking form. For 12 days after D-Day, everything seemed to be working beautifully. The bombarded floating breakwaters were in position. The Phoenix caissons formed solid walls. The whale piers stretched from the spud pierheads to the beaches, and trucks were already rolling across them carrying vital supplies to the army pushing inland. Ships by the hundreds were anchoring in the protected waters, unloading mountains of ammunition, food, fuel, and equipment. The impossible dream was becoming reality, and commanders began to believe that the gamble of the Mulberry Harbors might actually win the war. Then nature delivered a crushing blow. On June 19th, just 13 days after D-Day, the weather began to change. A storm was building in the northeast, and as it moved toward Normandy, the seas began to rise. At first, it seemed like just another channel storm, unpleasant but manageable. But this was no ordinary storm. This was the worst storm to hit the Normandy coast in over 40 years, and it would rage for 3 full days, from June 19th through June 22nd. The Mulberry Harbors had been designed with summer weather in mind, and no one had expected a storm of this ferocity so early in the season. The winds howled to gale force, driving waves up to 15 feet high and 300 feet long, far beyond what the structures had been tested for. The bombardons were the first to fail. These floating breakwaters that were supposed to ride up and down with the waves began to break loose from their anchors as the seas grew more violent. Once free, they became battering rams, smashing into the Phoenix caissons and the blockships with enormous force. The concrete caissons, designed to withstand wave pressure from outside, were not built to handle impacts from heavy floating objects on the inside. Cracks appeared, then grew, and seawater began pouring into chambers that were supposed to stay dry. Some caissons shifted on the seabed or tilted at crazy angles. Blockships broke their backs, the old metal hulls simply snapping in half under stress they were never designed to endure. The whale roadways, those flexible bridges that had seemed so clever, began to tear apart as the pontoons supporting them were lifted and slammed down by waves. Steel cables snapped like threads, and entire sections of roadway broke free and washed away. The spud pierheads fared better because their heavy legs held them in place, but even they were damaged as debris crashed against them, and the violent motion stressed their structures. At Omaha Beach, where the American Mulberry Harbor was located, the damage was catastrophic. When the storm finally subsided on June 22nd, the harbor was completely destroyed. 21 of the 28 Phoenix caissons were wrecked beyond repair, smashed to pieces or toppled on their sides. The roadways were gone, torn to pieces and scattered across the seabed. Bombardons lay twisted and half sunk. The harbor that had taken months to design and build and weeks to install was gone in just 3 days. The scene after the storm was heartbreaking. Engineers stood on the beach staring at the wreckage of their miracle harbor, seeing months of work and millions of pounds of materials reduced to rubble. Ships that had been safely anchored in the calm water of the harbor were now damaged or driven ashore. The rate of supply delivery dropped dramatically, threatening the entire invasion. American troops pushing inland needed ammunition, food, fuel, and reinforcements, but without Mulberry A, getting those supplies to them became much harder. Some commanders feared the invasion might stall, that the Germans might counterattack while the Allies struggled with their supply problems. But the British Mulberry B harbor at Arromanches had survived, badly damaged but still functional. The British engineers and crews had managed to keep it working through the storm, and now they faced a crucial decision. Should they try to repair Mulberry B, or should they salvage what they could and give up on the whole artificial harbor concept? The decision was made to not only repair Mulberry B, but to make it even better by using salvaged parts from the destroyed American harbor. Crews worked around the clock to tow usable Phoenix caissons from Omaha Beach to Arromanches, to recover undamaged roadway sections, to repair pierheads and replace broken components. It was a massive job done under terrible conditions with the war raging all around them, but somehow they pulled it off. By early July, Mulberry B was back in full operation, larger and stronger than before. Ships were once again unloading in protected waters, trucks were rolling across the whale roadways 24 hours a day, and the supplies were flowing to the armies fighting inland. Meanwhile, at Omaha Beach, the Americans adapted by developing techniques for unloading ships directly onto the beach at low tide, a much harder and slower process, but one that kept supplies moving. The surviving gooseberry breakwaters at Omaha provided some protection from waves, and the beach became a kind of open-air harbor with ships being deliberately grounded at high tide, unloaded at low tide, and then refloated when the tide came back in. It was improvised and chaotic, but it worked well enough to keep the American armies supplied. Over the next 10 months, from June 1944 until the harbor was finally decommissioned in late November, Mulberry B at Arromanches handled an astonishing amount of cargo. More than 2.5 million men passed through its piers. Over 500,000 vehicles rolled across its roadways. 4 million tons of supplies were unloaded at its pierheads. These numbers are so large they are hard to comprehend, but they represent everything an army needs to fight and win a war, from bullets and bombs to beans and bandages, from tanks and trucks to tents and typewriters. Behind these massive numbers were thousands of individual human beings doing difficult and dangerous work day after day in all kinds of weather. The crews operating the pierheads and roadways worked 12 or 16-hour shifts, guiding ships in, securing cargo, directing truck drivers across the floating bridges. The tugboat captains who had towed the Phoenix caissons and other components across the channel became harbor pilots, maneuvering vessels in crowded waters where a single mistake could cause a disaster. The maintenance crews who kept everything working performed miracles of improvisation, welding broken steel, patching damaged pontoons, and replacing worn-out cables while waves crashed around them. The men who had sunk the blockships to form the Gooseberries had watched their ships go down knowing they were giving up vessels that could never be recovered, making a one-way sacrifice for the cause. And in Britain, the 45,000 workers who had built the Mulberry components often did not learn what they had created until months or even years later, when the story was finally revealed to the public. Many of them felt enormous pride knowing their work in factories and on construction sites had helped win the war, even though they never saw the finished harbors and never heard the gratitude of the soldiers whose lives their work had saved. The Mulberry Harbors also represented international cooperation on a massive scale. While the British designed and built most of the components, American Seabees and Navy crews helped construct parts of Mulberry A and provided crucial assistance in towing and installing components. Canadian engineers contributed expertise and manpower. Workers from multiple countries labored together, often not even speaking the same language, but united by the common goal of defeating Nazi Germany. The engineering innovations developed for Mulberry influenced harbor and offshore construction for decades after the war. The techniques for building and floating massive concrete structures were refined and used in peacetime projects. The lessons learned about designing flexible structures that could survive harsh ocean conditions informed the development of offshore oil platforms, floating bridges, and modern temporary harbors still used by militaries around the world. The idea that you could bring a complete port with you rather than having to capture one revolutionized military thinking about amphibious operations. Never again would armies be completely dependent on seizing enemy harbors intact. Today, if you visit the beaches of Normandy, you can still see remnants of the Mulberry Harbors. At Arromanches, several Phoenix caissons remain visible at low tide, massive concrete blocks sitting on the sand like monuments to human ingenuity and determination. They have been there for over 80 years now, battered by waves and weather but still standing, silent witnesses to the greatest invasion in history. Local museums display pieces of the whale roadways and tell the story of the artificial harbors to tourists from around the world. In Britain, a few components that never made the journey to France have been preserved. A section of whale roadway sits at Southampton, lifted from the water and put on display so people can see the clever engineering that allowed flexible roadways to work in moving water. Phoenix caissons that stayed behind for various reasons rest in British harbors, too large and expensive to move, but too historically important to destroy. These physical remnants matter because they remind us that behind every great military victory are not just soldiers with weapons, but also engineers with slide rules, workers with welding torches, and ordinary people doing extraordinary things. The story of the Mulberry Harbors teaches us several powerful lessons that remain relevant today. First, it shows that seemingly impossible problems can be solved if people are willing to think creatively and take risks. When Churchill challenged his engineers to create portable harbors, many thought it could not be done, but they tried anyway and succeeded in ways that changed history. Second, it demonstrates the crucial importance of logistics in military operations. All the brave soldiers and brilliant generals in the world cannot win wars without supplies, and those supplies have to come from somewhere. The Mulberry Harbors were not glamorous or exciting like tank battles or air raids, but they were absolutely essential to Allied victory in Europe. Third, the story reminds us that failure can be temporary and that adapting to setbacks is often more important than avoiding them entirely. When the storm destroyed Mulberry A, the engineers did not give up. They salvaged what they could, repaired what remained, and found new ways to accomplish their mission. That resilience and adaptability were as much a part of the Allied victory as any battle. Historians have debated for decades how much the Mulberry Harbors actually mattered to the success of the Normandy invasion. Some argue that the harbors were essential, and that without them the invasion would have failed, or at least taken much longer with many more casualties. They point to the millions of tons of supplies landed through Mulberry B, and argue that there was simply no other way to deliver that much material in such a short time. Other historians suggest that the capture of conventional ports like Cherbourg and eventually Antwerp were more important in the long run, and that the Allies could have managed without the Mulberries, though it would have been harder and slower. The truth probably lies somewhere in between. The Mulberry Harbors were crucial in the critical first weeks and months after D-Day, when the Allied armies were most vulnerable, when they were still establishing their foothold in France and could have been pushed back into the sea if supplies had failed. By the time larger conventional ports were captured and reopened, the invasion was secure, and the armies were pushing deep into France. Without Mulberry B, that critical early period would have been far more difficult and dangerous. So while the harbors might not have been absolutely indispensable in the strictest sense, they made success much more likely and probably saved thousands of lives by speeding up the supply process and allowing the invasion to build momentum quickly. The statistics tell their own story of success. In the first month after D-Day, when the beachhead was most vulnerable, Mulberry B helped land over 600,000 tons of supplies. That included the ammunition for every bullet fired, the fuel for every truck and tank, the food for every soldier, and the medical supplies for every wounded man. In just 1 month, the artificial harbor moved more cargo than many conventional ports handle in a year. And it did this while under occasional German artillery fire and air attack, while dealing with unpredictable weather, and while being repaired and modified constantly to fix damage and improve efficiency. The fact that it worked at all is remarkable. The fact that it worked so well is almost miraculous. Consider also what did not happen because of the Mulberry Harbors. The Allies did not have to fight prolonged battles for fortified ports in the early weeks of the invasion. They did not have to wait weeks or months for captured ports to be demined and repaired before supplies could flow. They did not face the nightmare scenario of troops running out of ammunition while fighting in the hedgerows of Normandy. The Mulberries prevented these disasters, and preventing disaster is often the most important kind of success, even if it is less dramatic than winning victories. Looking back across the decades, the Mulberry Harbors stand as a testament to what human beings can achieve when they refuse to accept that something is impossible. In the dark days of World War II, when the fate of civilization hung in the balance, engineers and workers in Britain built harbors that had never existed before, harbors that could float across 100 miles of ocean and assemble themselves off enemy beaches. They did this not knowing for certain that it would work, not knowing if the German defenses could be overcome, not knowing if the weather would cooperate or destroy everything they built. They did it on faith, on determination, and on the absolute necessity of trying because the alternative was unthinkable. The men who designed the Phoenix caissons and Whale roadways and Spud pierheads were not superhuman. They were ordinary engineers with pencils and paper, working with the materials and knowledge available in the 1940s, often making educated guesses because no one had ever built anything like this before. The workers who poured the concrete and welded the steel were regular people with families and lives, working long hours because they knew their nation needed them. The crews who assembled the harbors under fire were sailors and soldiers doing their duty even when exhausted and scared. And yet together, All these ordinary people created something extraordinary, something that helped turn the tide of the war and shape the world we live in today. The Mulberry Harbors were not perfect. They faced problems and limitations. One harbor was destroyed by a storm. The other required constant maintenance and eventually wore out. But they succeeded in their essential mission, which was to put an entire army ashore in Normandy and keep that army supplied until victory was won. In the end, that is what matters most. Not whether the solution was elegant or permanent, but whether it worked when it was needed most. The improvised piers of the Mulberry Harbors did exactly that. They gave the Allies the edge they needed at the most critical moment of the war. They turned hostile beaches into working ports almost overnight. They helped prove that with enough creativity, determination, and courage, human beings can solve even the most impossible-seeming problems. The concrete blocks still sitting on the sand at Arrowmanches are monuments to that truth, weathered by decades of storms but still standing, still testifying to what was accomplished there in the desperate summer of 1944, when the world hung in the balance, and an improvised pier helped save civilization itself.